I have a sort of classic mountain scene here, and it's also exhibits a classic background, midground, and foreground, which is important in any landscape. It's more obvious in some than others, but it's important to see, and it's not always easy to see in a photograph, because one of the things that happens in a photograph is the plane, of course, is flattened out. So we don't get the experience of background, foreground, and midground like we do if we are actually on the scene. And we're not taught to think about it either, so we're not conscious of it. But if we were to simplify this and say the sky and those distant mountains are the background, these hills, which are closer to us, are the midground, and then these trees and these trees here, and especially the trees and bushes in the front, are the foreground, then we break it down into three simple shapes. It might look like this. We have the sky and the mountains, and then this would register as the midground. It's a little bit more intense color than the background, but there's not a lot of detail in the midground. We know that there are individual trees back there, but we don't see them. And then the foreground, where we do see detail, and the colors are much brighter, and the edges are much sharper. And that's what visually tells us that these bushes and that tree are in front of that meadow or whatever it is, those distant trees and hills, and finally the mountains in the background. So the color between this and this is very close. So in doing this in colored pencil, I first marked off very simply the edges of where certain elements started and stopped. For instance, this mark here marks off where this meadow is, and then this mark marks off those hills, and then that one marks the start of the distant mountains. So I had just a blank square here to start with, and just these markings. I did that because I didn't want to put a line in, because if I do that, that line might stay there. It would be a hard edge, and then it looks like more like a coloring book than a drawing or a painting, for instance. So that was enough guide, since these shapes are fairly simple, and I'm not worried about rendering them exactly. I'm not worried about the bumps in my mountains being exact, because I'm not doing this to render this scene so that someone recognizes, oh, I know where that is. If I was doing that, I would need to do a more detailed sketch, but I would keep the lines very soft. But I'm not concerned about that, and I'm confident that I can reproduce these shapes well enough if I just give myself some little guidelines. And then I did the tree. I just did some very rough markings just to show where the tree cuts into the mountains there, but I didn't do any detail there. Then the first thing I did was to go in and do very simple color. I left the sky to come back to that later so that I wouldn't make the mistake of making the sky too dark. And the palette I used, and again, this is just my choice, but I used 3 different blues, and if you remember the color wheel, there's warm colors and cool colors, and even within the cool colors, there are warmer blues and cooler blues. So this is more toward a turquoise, which would be warmer. This is a very light blue, and I want these fairly sharp because I'm going to use them on the side. And then this is a darker blue. Then I use 3 different greens. And again, I have a coolish green and a dark green. This is actually called juniper green, but it has a lot of blue in it. This is more like a grass green, and this is a chartreuse. And then I have two different purples. You could also use a darker red. This is a plum, and this is a lavender. So I went in with the lavender, and I'm working on the side of the pencil because I'll get a more painterly look. And I don't have details that I really need to go in on the point. And if I go in on the point, I might get wide markings like these and too dark, and I will never be able to blend them. So if I use the side of the pencil, and I went so lightly so I could just barely see it, because I don't want that far mountain range to get very dark. If you look at the picture, it's so hazy because it's so far away. The atmosphere is mixed with it, and it's not that far off in tone or intensity from the sky. Then I did the same thing with the closer up mountains, and I used a blue just so I could distinguish it. There's really, these two are bluish, but I'm not trying to exactly reproduce those colors. That's nearly impossible in any media, but particularly a photograph is laid down with ink from a printer, and it's a very different substance than a colored pencil. So I want to get the dynamic of the colors, but not necessarily match the colors. So again, I went in with a blue and very, very carefully, just enough tone so that I could see it, and not worried about getting the different intensities here. I merely wanted to get the planes of color like we see here. And then for the foreground, I went in very lightly with, actually that's the chartreuse. I went in with this and very, very lightly put down these spans of color. Then when I had done that, and I put in just some flat tone to get the tree, very, very light again. Then I went back and began adding the dark places to represent these dark patches of green in the tree, to identify those first. And so they show up in different places. I just followed what I was seeing there. I put in the trunk so that I wouldn't lose sight of that. And then to deepen it a little bit, I went in with this darker blue into those places that are fairly dark. And then in just a few places, to really deepen it, I went in with this plum. It happened to be nearby. You could use like a red. You'd have to be very careful, but red and green are complementary colors, so it would deepen it a little bit and give it some dimension. And so I worked my way around. I would work my way around, getting the lights and darks, doing these layers. And the sky, I went very lightly in with the very light blue, and I'm thinking I wouldn't even put any tone down here, just leave that light and not outline the clouds. Even though it looks that way here, just give a little definition on the top, maybe a side, and the eye does the rest. And it's a much more pleasing look, makes a much nicer image. Now this would work well also with what we discovered last time with the oil pastel. So could get some nice blending going on. And I'm not very far into this, so I'd have to work it and see how it would be best. But again, I went in and just put the plain tone in. Then I went in with the oil pastel and coated the whole thing. I could still see the color. And then I went in with the colored pencil. Oops, that's not the right color. Went in with this one. I may have to scratch that out with my finger or a razor blade. And as we learned last time, I can go back and forth and get some very nice sky looking like things. One thing to keep in mind in using this process is that with the white oil pastel, the colored pencils are a little bit lighter. So you might have to go for the darkest colored pencils that are in your box to really get the deep colors. Or just have a lighter overall drawing, and that would be okay too.